The rain had been falling for hours, soaking through the heavy fabric of Sergeant James Kellen's uniform as he trudged through the ruined outskirts of a village that hadn't seen peace in years, his boots sinking slightly into the mud with every step. The air smelled of smoke, old fire, and damp concrete, the kind of scent that buried itself in your memory and refused to leave. The unit had secured the area earlier that morning, clearing out any remaining threats, but the silence that now surrounded them was thick, unnatural, and filled with invisible weight. James moved cautiously, rifle lowered but ready, eyes scanning every doorway, every cracked window, every flicker of movement between the broken buildings. Most of the locals had evacuated weeks ago. What remained was a hollow shell of what had once been a quiet farming community, now reduced to craters, collapsed roofs, and charred walls. He stepped over a fallen gate, then paused, hearing something, faint but distinct. It wasn't gunfire, not footsteps. It was a whimper, short, soft, and full of fear. He turned toward a collapsed barn at the edge of the property, its roof caved in, one side blackened by fire. The whimper came again. Slowly, James approached, heart beating faster now, not from fear, but something else. He pushed aside a half-burned wooden beam and ducked inside, flashlight beam cutting through the haze of dust. That's when he saw it. Tucked into the corner behind a shattered water trough, partially hidden beneath a tarp, was a small dog. Its fur was matted and filthy, a patchwork of mud, ash, and dried blood. One ear was torn. Ribs poked visibly beneath its skin, but its eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, locked onto his and didn't look away. James lowered his weapon immediately. "Hey," he whispered, barely a sound, as if speaking too loud might break the fragile connection between them. The dog didn't growl, didn't run, just watched. It was trembling, clearly injured, but still alert. James knelt slowly, took off one of his gloves, and reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a half-eaten protein bar, unwrapped it halfway, and gently placed it on the floor. The dog didn't move at first. Then, carefully, it limped forward, nose twitching. One paw at a time. James didn't move. After a few moments, the dog reached the bar, sniffed it, then began to eat in frantic, desperate bites. When it was done, it sat back, still watching him. James whispered again, "It's okay. You're okay now?" For some reason, he believed that. He reached out, palm open. The dog flinched but didn't retreat. Slowly, it let him touch its muzzle. Its fur was coarse, damp, and sticky with old blood. "Poor thing," James said. "What the hell happened to you?" He stayed there for nearly an hour, feeding the dog water from his canteen, inspecting its wounds, trying to gain its trust. Eventually, he called it Shadow, not just because of its black fur, but because it had followed him silently, almost invisibly, when he finally stood and began to leave. The dog limped behind him all the way to the field base. At first, no one said anything. The guys were used to James being quiet, serious, always the last to joke, and the first to volunteer for the dangerous jobs. When they saw the battered mutt trailing him into camp, ears back, eyes nervous, they chuckled, but didn't question it. One of the medics helped clean the dog's wounds. Another soldier offered up some jerky. Over the next few weeks, they became inseparable. Patrols, mealtimes, even night watches. Shadow stayed close, never straying far from James's side. The dog still limped, but was healing fast, telling stories he hadn't told anyone else. About his sister, about how their dad used to train shepherds back home, about the last time he'd seen his mom. Shadow would tilt his head, listen like he understood, then rest it on James's boot like to say, "I'm still here." But war didn't care about comfort. One morning, orders came in fast. Extraction point moved, enemy activity flaring up. They had to go, quick. Chaos. Gear packed. Orders shouted. In the rush, James held Shadow's collar, but a jeep passed, horn blaring, and the dog bolted, slipping from his grip, vanishing into the ruins. James shouted, chased, but couldn't find him. The war ended not with a bang, but with paperwork, silence, and the heavy thud of bags dropped in front of returning soldiers at customs. Sergeant James Kellen stood among the crowd in uniform, boots scuffed, eyes hollow, feeling more out of place than he ever had on the battlefield. Home was supposed to mean comfort, but the world he came back to was quieter, colder, and full of things he no longer recognized. His apartment hadn't changed, his neighborhood hadn't changed, but he had, and the whole shadow left behind only deepened the sense that something essential had been torn from him and left behind in the dust of a ruined village thousands of miles away. For the first few weeks, he did what everyone expected. He answered the calls from family, went to debriefings, nodded through mandatory sessions with counselors who asked him how he felt and what his plans were, and he lied through all of it. He said he was adjusting fine, that he'd consider applying to school, maybe taking up security work. But none of that mattered. All he could think about was Shadow, where the dog might be now, whether he had survived, if he'd gone feral, or been taken in, or was still limping through ruins, waiting. The image haunted him, and no matter how much time passed, it didn't fade. One night, after a dream where he saw Shadow pacing the edge of that collapsed barn again, James woke up in a cold sweat and knew he had to act. He didn't tell anyone. He just started. The first thing he did was contact someone in his old unit, Jensen, who'd stayed behind a few extra months for decommission work. They talked over a scrambled call, James asking if he'd heard anything about animals left behind in their old zone. Jensen laughed at first, then realized James was serious. "You're really going back for that dog?" he asked. James simply said, "Yeah." That was enough. Jensen gave him names, coordinates, a few local translators and volunteers who had stayed behind to help rebuild. James began emailing, calling, searching. He filed papers for a travel visa, submitted endless documents, even lied about his reasons to some officials, saying he was visiting local charities he'd worked with during deployment. It took months. Red tape, delays, silence. But he didn't stop. Every spare dollar went toward the plan. Every night, instead of sleeping, he read about animal recovery laws, rescue protocols, import regulations for dogs. He didn't care how impossible it sounded. All he needed was a lead. Finally, one arrived. An aid worker named Lila, stationed near the same village, replied to his message. She remembered hearing stories about a black dog that used to follow patrols. Locals called it the ghost mutt. Said he was smart, fast, and uncatchable. Still limping, but always watching from shadows. James's heart jumped. That had to be him. Lila agreed to help. She sent photos taken near the old field base, grainy, distant shots of what might have been a dog near the ruins. James knew it was Shadow. Could feel it. The shape. The posture. It had to be. Within weeks, he was on a plane. The country felt different now. Less war, more rebuilding. But the pain in the air hadn't disappeared. It just shifted. James hired a guide, then another. Days of travel, back roads, villages, checkpoints. He finally returned to the same area where it all began. The barn was still there, barely. More collapsed than before. He stood there for nearly an hour, calling the name, softly at first, then louder. Nothing. He checked the old patrol routes, places they'd walked together, the empty field, the well, the burned shed where Shadow once chased a rat. Still nothing. Locals stared. One old man told him, through a translator, that dogs don't survive long here. James nodded, but didn't believe it. Shadow had survived a war. He would survive this. Weeks passed. Every night James slept in the same tent, in the same place they'd last been together. He left food out, water, his old boots. He played a recording of his own voice calling the name. Then, one night, the dish was empty. He thought it was a fluke, a fox. But the next night, he stayed awake, hidden, and he saw him. Thin, dirty, slower, but unmistakable. Shadow. The dog was at the edge of the trees, staring at the tent, watching, waiting. James didn't move. He whispered the name. Shadow. The dog tensed. James said it again, slower, softer. Not until the dog leaned in, pressed his head against James's chest, and let out the softest sound James had ever heard. Relief, recognition, forgiveness. That night, they sat under the stars together. Words. The next morning, James woke up before the sun had touched the edge of the trees, his back aching from the hard ground, but his heart lighter than it had been in over a year. Shadow was curled beside him, thin but alive, sleeping soundly like he hadn't in months, maybe years. The quiet was almost sacred. James didn't speak. He just sat in silence, watching the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest and the way the light softened the scars on his fur. But peace was short-lived. The reality of what came next settled over him like fog. Getting Shadow home wasn't going to be easy. It would require approvals, vaccinations, health checks, quarantine paperwork, and maybe most difficult of all, convincing people that the dog was worth the effort. James wasn't surprised by the resistance. The first vet he visited shook his head immediately. Too many risks, he said. Injuries, trauma, and he's been living feral, not fit to travel. James didn't argue. He just picked up Shadow and walked out. The next clinic was better, run by a kind local woman named Doctor Neha, who looked at Shadow with curiosity rather than suspicion. She ran tests, cleaned wounds, gave James a list of vaccines and schedules, and explained the long bureaucratic process ahead. James nodded through it all, taking notes, ignoring the cost. His savings were already almost gone, but he didn't care. He could sell the rest of his gear if needed. Shadow was improving daily. He was eating more, moving easier, and staying closer to James now, never straying more than a few feet. But the hardest part wasn't the physical care. It was the waiting. Endless forms, embassy approvals, government departments that took weeks to answer a single question. Every day, James checked his inbox. Nothing. Then one day, a denial. The transport request was rejected. No explanation, just a stamped response that the animal didn't meet import requirements. James felt a crack form inside him. All the effort, all the nights spent beside that ruined barn, all the hope, it felt like it was slipping. He reread the email 3 times before calling Lila, the aid worker who'd first helped him find Shadow. Her voice was tired but sympathetic. "You're not the first," she said, "but don't stop now. There are ways, just harder ones." She gave him a name, an American expat who specialized in rescue animal relocations. James contacted him that night. The man, gruff and efficient, didn't waste time. "I can't promise anything," he said, "but if you're willing to do the legwork, I'll walk you through it." And so began another wave of calls, meetings, new forms, updated vet records, interviews with customs officials, and securing a temporary shelter for Shadow near the capital while waiting for transport clearance. James hated being apart from him, but he visited daily, bringing food and sitting by the kennel for hours, telling stories like before. Shadow didn't understand, but he waited, trusted. Finally, after nearly 4 months, the final document came through, a single email with the subject line, "Approved for entry." James stared at it for a long time, then stood up and shouted so loud the neighbors knocked on the wall. The flight was booked within hours. Shadow would fly in a specialized crate, escorted by a rescue agent on a commercial flight. James couldn't afford the premium fee to travel in cargo with him, so he had to board a separate flight and wait stateside. Leaving Shadow at the airport was the hardest moment of the entire ordeal. He knelt by the crate, looking into those eyes, and whispered, "I'll be waiting. Don't be scared." Shadow didn't bark or cry. He just looked at him the way he always had, with complete, undeserved trust. James barely slept on his own flight. Every hour dragged like lead. He imagined turbulence, imagined delays, imagined red tape at customs, and someone deciding last minute that Shadow couldn't enter after all. But none of that happened. The moment James stepped into the arrivals hall at the stateside animal terminal, he saw the crate being wheeled in by a tired-looking handler. The door opened, a pause. Then a black blur launched forward, paws slamming against James's chest, knocking him to the floor in front of stunned travelers and airport staff. He laughed as Shadow licked his face, tail wagging with uncontainable joy. A crowd had gathered, but James didn't care. He buried his face in Shadow's neck and whispered, "We made it." They drove home in silence, windows down, wind in their hair, no music, no distractions. Just the sound of the road and the dog resting his head on James's lap every few minutes, as if to make sure it was real. The apartment was small and quiet. Shadow explored every corner with careful sniffs, then settled by the couch like he'd always belonged. There. And maybe he had. Over the next few weeks, they rebuilt their life. Slow walks in the park, long afternoons on the porch, moments of laughter that hadn't existed before. James started volunteering at a local shelter. Then he applied to work there. People asked about Shadow's limp, his scars, his wary look. James would smile and say, "It's a long story." But sometimes, when someone really wanted to know, he'd tell it. Not the war, not the paperwork, but the moment he saw a dog half buried in a collapsed barn, starving and scared, and knew, absolutely knew,